Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. This is Mahalaya Marshall from the IQ Consortium Secretariat. I'd like to thank you for joining this morning's webinar entitled Forging New Partnerships to Advance Pediatric Formulations Development, an overview of NIH resources spanning the formulation development lifecycle.
Thank you, Mahalaya. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I am Beth Galella from Bristol Myers Squibb and a member of the IQ Pediatric Working Group. And without further ado, I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Dr. James Cummins, PhD, is currently the Chief of the Preclinical Microbicide and Prevention Research Branch in the Prevention Sciences Program within the Division of AIDS at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, an institute within the U.S. NIH. As part of the Division of AIDS mission to develop highly effective HIV prevention strategies, Dr. Cummins leads a team that manages a portfolio of grants and contracts supporting the preclinical development of non-vaccine biomedical prevention products. Active grants in the portfolio support the development and optimization of the next generation of HIV prevention products, including sustained release, long-acting products, and multi-purpose prevention strategies. Current contract resources fill gaps in the product development pathways by enabling the acquisition of critical data, development of essential methods, product manufacturing characterization, and completion of studies necessary to advance products into clinical trials. These funding mechanisms have supported the development of a range of formulation types and facilitated the advancement of 12 products into NIAID-sponsored clinical trials. More recently, Dr. Cummins has expanded the capabilities of his branch to include support for the development of pediatric formulations for HIV treatment and prevention, including comorbidities such as tuberculosis. I'd like to turn it over to you, Dr. Cummins.
So let me start by thanking Beth and Mahalaya and the IQ Consortium for inviting me to give this presentation. Can you?
Perfect.
Okay, you can now. Okay, all right. So I wanted to start by just talking about what are the goals of this presentation. So some of you are likely very familiar with the mission of the NIH, but I thought I'd give you a few details about how we're organized and how this actually applies to what the topic at hand today, which is pediatric formulations. Then I'll move into some slides where I demonstrate our intention to use available resources at NIH to develop an age-appropriate formulation for HIV or TB. And then finally, I'll highlight the opportunity to use these resources to supplement existing efforts and strengthen partnerships across organizations. So the outline of the presentation will include an overview of NIH and a description of a new contract resource that we're quite excited about that will be awarded in 2023. Then I'll describe how this contract resource is available to advance HIV prevention products, but with expansion into pediatric formulations for HIV treatment, as well as comorbidities such as TB. I'll explain some current efforts to develop a pediatric formulation roadmap and how this applies to the available resources and the need to identify stakeholders to work with us on this effort. And then give you some important information around how you can access the contract resource and the process behind that. And really ending here with this bullet that we really invite you as stakeholders in the field of pediatric formulations, whether you be an industrial partner or working in other organizations, that with your expertise and guidance, along with the resources that we have available at the NIH, we really hope that we can make a dent in this major issue of the lack of pediatric formulations, not just for HIV and TB, but really across the board for many infectious diseases. So who are we at NIH and what do we do? So we are one of the world's foremost medical research centers. Just some interesting facts. We have 168 NIH-supported scientists from around the world who have either shared or been the sole recipients of 99 Nobel Prizes in the areas of physiology or medicine, chemistry, physics, and economic sciences. In terms of how we're organized, the National Institutes of Health is one of 11 agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services. And you can see those listed on the upper left-hand side of this slide. You are very likely aware of some of the other agencies, such as CDC and FDA. If you look within the NIH, however, there's 27 different institutes and centers, and those are shown on the lower left side. And the overarching goals there are to foster fundamental creative discoveries, innovative research strategies, and applications as a basis to advance significantly the capacity to protect and improve human health, the ability to develop, maintain, and renew scientific, human, and physical resources that assure the capability to prevent disease, and then to expand the knowledge base in medical and associated sciences in order to enhance the economic well-being and ensure a continued high return on the public investment in research. So if you look among these 27 institutes, I pulled 3 institutes where we're aware of definite activities in the pediatric formulation space, but I should say that's likely not the only 3 institutes. We're such a big institution that we are reaching out to learn more about other potential partners within NIH. But I'll start first within my own institute, the Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So these are just some examples of activities focused in the area of pediatrics. For example, within NIAID, the development of long-acting or extended release antiretroviral products for HIV treatment and prevention in infants, children, and adolescents is a priority. We do this through contracts, grants, and other resources that support the development and advancement of age-appropriate formulations, as I've mentioned, for HIV and comorbidities such as TB. We have a sister institute, the Institute of Child Health and Human Development, that has priorities in the areas of developing age-appropriate formulations and pediatric drug delivery systems, fostering a better understanding of the scientific, technical, and regulatory barriers for the development of pediatric formulation, an interest in taste, smell, and flavor research in infants and children, and then the use and application of new drug delivery systems for pediatrics. And then interestingly, there's an institute at NIH on deafness and other communication disorders, which is really focused on how individuals interact with their environment. And so within that institute, there's an interest in studies of the chemical senses, such as taste, smell, and kinesthesis. And this would be to enhance our understanding of how individuals actually communicate and interact with their environments. And so that has potential implications, obviously, with the pediatric space. And then finally, the research on the development of bitter taste blockers to identify compounds that can mask the bitter taste of essential medications, which we all know is one of the more prominent processes that's been followed in the area of pediatric formulations. So moving on to the new contract that I mentioned a little bit earlier, it will be called Resources to Advance Pediatrics in HIV Prevention Science. We love our acronyms in the government, so we will refer to that as the RAPS contract. This is an extension of a current contract. You'll see the purpose here. Initially was to provide drug development resources to support advancement of the next generation of HIV biomedical prevention products. But what we've identified in blue is this exciting new expansion, which takes us into the maternal space. So we also have the ability to be working on projects that support pregnant or breastfeeding women, but also the ability to work in the pediatric space as well. The 3 major objectives of the program will include, first, the advancement of promising next generation HIV biomedical prevention products into human clinical testing. The second will be expansion of user preference studies to better understand desire and choice and how best to engage women and men in HIV treatment or prevention. We started with a project that I have shown here where we looked at adolescent girls and young women in South Africa. And so that project has been very informative about ways to reach out to individuals and determine their level of interest and encourage them, for example, to use HIV prevention products. But we realized that this type of research could be very important as potential studies for caregivers of pediatric populations to help inform the types of formulations that might be best for a particular caregiver, depending on the age of a child. And then finally, the third would be the provision of gap-filling resources to support the actual advancement of specific treatment and prevention strategies in maternal and pediatric populations. And so this is the objective that would cover development, manufacture, for example, of specific age-appropriate formulations, but it also allows us the ability to look at different strategies within newborns and infants as well. So I wanted to give you just a sense of how our contracts within NIAID have worked over the past 10 years or so in the development of formulations for HIV, and these are non-vaccine products. And so over the past 12 years, our contracts have supported the development of 12 product INDs and led to the activation of multiple clinical trials to test these products. We've supported formulation types that have included topical gels, films, intravaginal rings, a long-acting injectable, as well as an implant. And then we have products that have evolved from early topical microbicide products to much more advanced sustained release formulations that we're seeing today. So really the bottom graphic is just meant to demonstrate some of the milestones along the way. I started in the area of topical gels, and so tenofovir gel was developed over a number of years at NIH. But the Achilles heel of this particular product was it was not being used by young women at high risk of HIV in South Africa. And so for us, an incredible learning lesson that the end user assessments that I mentioned earlier are critical to informing what a product formulation should look like and whether it will be used by end users. The second item you see along the bottom is the dapivirine intravaginal ring. And so this was a product that was approved in March of 2022 by the South African Regulatory Authority. So it's exciting that women at risk of HIV have access to a product that's specifically designed for them. And then over on the right-hand side, I've mentioned we're in this new space of trying to deliver better systemic options for delivery of products. The idea is that we don't want a dosing interval that's too short. For example, if you think about Truvada on the upper left that was approved in July of 2012 for PrEP, it's an exciting development, but there are those that struggle with daily pills. And so moving towards longer acting products such as the cabotegravir injection that you see on the upper right that was approved a year ago in December of 2021. That's an exciting advancement because it certainly helps overcome the need for daily pills, but this is a product that has to be injected every 8 weeks. And so there are those that have issues with having to return, for example, to the doctor 6 times a year for an injection. So for us, we're very much interested in the next generation of products, whether it be implants, patches, or other novel strategies that would reduce that dosing interval and hopefully increase end user compliance in, for example, adolescent and adult populations. So what are the resources available to any of you out there that might be interested in working with us on a pediatric formulation? And so this slide really addresses the structure of the contract. And I think what you should focus on are the dark blue squares along the bottom. And so this contract is divided into task areas that can provide very unique services depending on the need of a product developer. So on the left-hand side, you'll see preclinical gap filling services. So we have had over the years a number of developers that have gaps in their IND. So they need critical safety and toxicity studies performed. They may need drug-drug interaction studies performed and to complete their IND and get into their first clinical testing. And reprotox, which may be relevant for maternal pregnancy type studies. And so that task area gives us the flexibility to conduct those types of studies to accelerate the process for development of key formulations. The second area, HIV animal models, this is an area that has given us the ability to generate critical PK data that is often used to model, for example, what the human dose might be. Although FDA does not require efficacy studies in animal models, within the HIV space, we have seen many groups that before they move into human clinical testing, they demonstrate protection, for example, in an SIV challenge model. So we have the ability to generate that critical PK/PD data as necessary. The third area, and in some cases our developers need a bioanalytical method developed for a specific animal species or for human trials. We have the ability to create a method from scratch, or perhaps to transfer methods between groups and labs. The fourth area, which I think is exciting for us, is we do have the ability through CMC and GMP manufacturing to actually produce product for clinical evaluation. I should say that the scope of this is really limited to very early clinical studies. So we would be looking at early pilot feasibility of formulations, leading into GMP manufacture for very early first in human or phase 1 studies. But we do have contractors that would be willing to work with scale up or transfer of any manufacturing methods to other CMOs or other groups that would be out there. And I think that's an important point. If we collaborate on specific formulations and downstream, we hope to transfer to manufacturing, for example. The fifth area that you see there is scientific and quality regulatory support. So really for us, it's been a key area to bring in consultants to supplement the lack of expertise in key areas that we don't necessarily have within our program at NIH. And it also gives us the ability to convene scientific groups and workshops, which has been really important, as I'll talk about, to jumpstart and get us focused on how we can use this contract for pediatric formulations. And then finally on the right, creating desire for products. I mentioned earlier that we learned the hard way that you don't build a product and expect people to use it. You have to build that product smartly by making sure you include feedback from the end users so that they will likely want to use that product. And so that's what we mean by creating desire for a product. And certainly there is some potential space there, I think, to interact with the caregivers on key formulations. So I mentioned that this contract, it will be awarded next year, but it's an extension of a current contract. And so we did not want to wait until 2023. We really wanted to get, as I mentioned, a good jump start on pediatric formulations. So we began by engaging outside experts and consultants. And really they were instrumental in helping us start to shape what this roadmap that I mentioned would look like. And so we reached out to Doctors Dixik, Hoog, and Schaffelberger, who should be attending in the audience of this webinar, and started to tap into their knowledge base around where do we start and what should the next steps be. And it really starts with assisting NIAID in planning contract activities to support these types of formulations. It included an initial consultation that we held a year ago last summer to bring together relevant stakeholders to discuss key gaps and challenges, to identify potential gap-filling activities for prioritized formulations, and to discuss potential ways to leverage private-public partnerships to advance these critical formulations. I did want to just put a comment out there about intellectual property. I know that there are a number of pharmaceutical companies and others that may have some concerns about working with the government and how intellectual property might be protected. And then if we also think about the downstream that I mentioned, that we could cover some early manufacturing, but ideally, if we're thinking and focused on getting a product that will make it out into the real world, we need to be thinking all the way down to generic manufacturing and ways to accelerate global access to these formulations. So I don't want groups out there to think that there's significant barriers. We do have an Office of Technology Transfer and Intellectual Property. We have agreements that we work with other companies and other stakeholders in the past to limit and minimize risk and figure out ways to advance these critical products, whether they be an HIV prevention product for adults or in the future, a pediatric formulation. So this is the current research strategy that we've been developing over the past couple of years. It really started with this workshop that I mentioned in July of 2021. This was focused on the technology, so the drug delivery system or the issue around how to deliver the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient in the formulation. And so based on that, we have some priorities that I'll focus on and describe a little bit later. But that would lead into the therapeutic, marrying the technology with the right API, so the therapeutic selection. And we don't want to duplicate. I think that's important. There are a number, many different organizations that are involved in pediatric formulations, I'm sure you're well aware of. And so a mandate for my leadership is not to duplicate, but to synergize. So for example, in the area of HIV and TB, the PATO groups through the WHO are very much focused on prioritization of the drugs that are needed in children. So for us, it's really taking those prioritized lists, identifying the places where we think our resources would best fit, and identifying, as is indicated in the next, if you move over to the next item, is partner engagement. So once we identify a technology and the drug, who are the partners that we need to be working with to develop a plan that includes all the way through the downstream of rollout of the formulation. And so this would lead into manufacturing. And I mentioned that we have the ability under the contract to manufacture a formulation, but we also have our clinical network, which I'll describe as well. It's the IMPACT network sponsored by NIH, in which we would have the ability to do some early human testing. And so that would ultimately lead to what would be the child-friendly formulation. At the bottom, I should mention that the feedback and recommendations from outside experts is really meant to supplement our expertise. We realize that it's needed. And then finally, just that last bullet, that specific funding mechanisms, our team within program will be working on those, and we do have to do an independent assessment for how we put those funding opportunities together. But we can do it, I think, in tandem to any of the activities that we would be doing with collaborators through the consortium or any others. So I wanted to just give an example of the roadmap that we've been working on with our consultants, and we thought about it in two different ways, and so it's color-coded. So if you look at the green, I mentioned we started with this technology gap analysis, starting with this workshop last summer, and so we can think of it in several different ways. What would be new technology that would take us longer to develop? So we would need to be thinking about a longer term strategy for those types of formulations, and long-acting products would be a good example of that. Also, that second box there indicating existing technology, such as, for example, taste masking or bitter blocking. Could we be thinking about a project more short-term or mid-term that we could get started on sooner and start to work on that formulation or that activity? And I should also mention that activities don't have to be strictly focused on a drug formulated product, that there could be some drug agnostic activities, placebo formulations, excipients, wherever there's a gap that would benefit the field as a whole. We could also apply those contract resources to that. And then at the bottom there in the green, you see the pediatric quality targeted product profile for antiretrovirals, which would be based on a TPP, a targeted product profile. And that for us is really key, that's a driver to develop that profile and to use it as a benchmark for key milestones and decision making as we move forward. And as the dashed arrows indicate, that pathway would synergize with this therapeutic gap analysis that I mentioned earlier, that once we are able within program to identify a prioritized drug, reach out to potential partners and identify a partner that was willing to work with us, and then think about what the manufacturing would look like for that particular product. And then I've shown at the bottom that all of that could be facilitated through our contract. Then there would need to be a handover at some point to our other partners. And so I mentioned the clinical evaluation, for example, would be done by our impact network. But then we would also want to bring in relevant stakeholders to be thinking about what that regulatory review would look like, what the steps, the critical steps that would be needed ultimately to roll out and scale up the pediatric formulation. For us in the HIV prevention space, given the fact that our resources are limited, but we synergize with our partners, I show on the left that in HIV prevention, we've worked with a number of varied groups of partners, whether it be our clinical network, not-for-profit groups, as well as drug companies themselves. And so, for example, the Microbicide Trials Network was instrumental in testing the intravaginal ring that I mentioned, the dapivirine ring, and also looking at the part IPM was the sponsor, the International Partnership for Microbicides. So we worked closely with IPM and the MTN to ensure that we supported preclinically what was necessary to help get that product into clinical testing. And then, for example, with ViiV, I mentioned the cabotegravir injection. Our contract was really instrumental in some of the initial PK/PD studies in non-human primates that was used to inform that product as it moved into clinical testing. And so in the middle, I just show, as we all know, drug development is a tortuous path. It's not straight. We really have to leverage relationships and identify opportunities to work with others to make things happen. And so on the upper right-hand side, I show potential future partners. We've already engaged, for example, with the European Pediatric Formulation Initiative and starting some really exciting conversations with that group, as well as the Global Accelerator for Pediatric Formulations, GAPF. And we're really hopeful with some of the feedback that we're getting from these groups that we have some activities in the next year that we can get started on under the contract, which is exciting. We also have had several interactions with the Pediatric Network, the Impact Network, and their leadership is equally as interested in figuring out ways to leverage this contract resource to really move forward with some of these pediatric formulations. So I did want to give just a little bit of insight around, if any of you are asking, well, how do you access or start to access the resource that I'm describing? So it really starts with our outside groups identifying specific needs. And so this could either be done through a working group, a workshop, as we did last summer, or it can be a group that has a specific challenge themselves with developing a formulation, marrying the API with the drug delivery platform, the need for early studies to look at drug-drug interactions, for example, pre-formulation work. All of that could potentially be done under the contract. And then thinking about pilot projects, if there's a pilot activity, either preclinically or perhaps a pilot activity going into early clinical studies, that's something that we could consider as a specific need. And so once the request is presented to us within program, we go through our own independent assessment. We kind of put it all together, assess these requests against our own priorities, and then we also have to look, of course, against our available resources to see if it makes sense. And so we go through this process, I'll describe once a year, is when we can receive requests throughout the entire year, but based on our contracting cycle, we have to make some key decisions each year about which activity we'll fund and support. And I'll describe that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. But once, and this is a 7-year contract, I should mention that, it will run from 2023 to 2030. And then once we've actually selected the projects and funded them, then the activity is initiated with our contractors. At that stage, you as the group that's requested the activity is brought back in and will be intimately involved in the design and implementation of those activities for however long that particular activity may take. So this really graphically represents what I just said about receipt of requests for services. So we can receive, if you have an idea for a project or you want to reach out to us to talk about specific needs, that can happen at any point during the calendar year. And so that's shown in blue at the top. But I mentioned that we have to go through a process where we identify and prioritize the requests that we think are the most significant that we could fund. And then we go through a NIAID approval process with leadership within our institute. And so that typically happens by the end of February at the latest. Then once we've actually prioritized, we have to go through the contracting process itself with our contractors. And that's shown in green at the bottom. So between January and May, basically we start to identify the technical requirements, the statement of work, some other contractual issues that have to be put in place. We put out a request to our contractors to bid on the work and to propose on it. And then based on our review of that, usually between May and September, we will award the task orders for that work for that given year. And then we just essentially repeat the cycle each fiscal year. So how do you learn more about these resources? And you will have, I think, a PDF version of these slides will be distributed after the seminar. But there's a couple of web pages that I think would be very useful. There's one that describes the RAPS contracts and just provides you a little bit more details in case I went too quickly today. You'll be able to go back and look specifically at some of the details about what exactly we can support. And then at the bottom on the lower right-hand side, there's a web page that discusses, well, how do you actually access these resources? And to be honest, the easiest way, I think I am listed as a contact on that web page. If you have specific questions or want to join us for an initial consultation or conversation about an idea or a concept for a project, it really just reaching out to me is probably the more direct way of doing it. And then I wanted to end with, this is a poster that we basically presented at the European UPFI meeting in September. And so we basically gave an overview of our workshop from last summer. And then we identified some key areas that we thought, these are not exclusive, but we thought we would put out there some key areas that we could possibly collaborate on. And those being long-acting formulations, a neonate formulation platform, and then research into taste masking and universal blockers. And so these, of course, are just meant to be a starting point. But if any of you out there see or have seen in my slides some areas that you're very interested in seeing, that you could engage with us to think about what it would take to get these important formulations developed, certainly feel free to contact us and engage in that conversation. And then finally, I just wanted to end by acknowledging really two groups that have been instrumental in helping us get this contract off the ground. On the left-hand side, our current contractor under our contract, Advanced Bioscience Laboratories, Alex and Peter have been instrumental in just organizing and helping us with our consultants, and you'll see those three listed there that I mentioned earlier, Trupti, Steve, and Daniel, who have been fantastic in helping us put together this roadmap and plans. And then on the right-hand side, my colleagues within the Division of AIDS at NIAID, we are a part of the Prevention Sciences program, and those include Thomas, Patrick, Hans, and Taisha, who have been really helpful in helping us keep this project on track. So with that, I will stop and entertain questions.
Thank you, James, very much for a great presentation, very informative, and thank you for bringing awareness to such these valuable contract resources to advance HIV treatment and prevention in pediatrics. A lot of wonderful work is being done. We have one question. Is the pediatric development and services that are provided and collaboration available only for HIV and TB or for other areas such as oncology?
So that's a great question. So the way we wrote the contract, we're not exclusively limited to HIV and comorbidities like TB. So I think for us, the caveat is that's our mission. But at the same time, we realize there's a lack of these critical formulations across the board. So for us, I think you could approach us with that request. We would likely have to consult with colleagues, for example, NCI and others, to see what resources they may have. But in many cases, NIH is we're a collaborative, the institutes overall are collaborative. And so I would say, don't think of that as a barrier. We would entertain it, but we might have to have some further discussions with the relevant institutes on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Last call for questions. I don't see any additional questions online right now. Give it another minute while we close off. But I just wanted to thank you once again for taking your time to present today. And I think that the actually, okay. So one more question just popped up. You mentioned GAP-F. Can you elaborate on the communication with GAP-F?
So at this point, we've engaged with GAP-F. We've had a couple of calls with them, and then my leadership is actually involved in a meeting this week. Some of you may be aware of the Rome meetings that are focused on in the area of pediatrics and pregnant women. And so we're in the early stages of establishing what that collaboration would look like. So I can't really give much detail at this point. But we have received a list of where they're hopeful that we could use our contract to work with them on that. So hopefully in the near future, I'll be able to give a better answer. But communications wise, we're working with their leadership at this point, yes.
Okay, thank you. And a clarification is being requested. Is the deadline for 2023 award in February? If I'm reading that right.
So yes, so I think for us, if there's the possibility of an activity for this year, contact us as soon as possible, because the deadlines that I told you about, our Office of Acquisitions, that the queue of task orders that they have for the year is getting longer every year. So it's really a matter of logistics and timing. However, if you approach us and have a project that's worth consideration, for example, to get started in FY23, we can entertain it. And then if it looks like it might take a little bit longer to pull it together and to get what we need, we can certainly work with the Office of Acquisitions to see if we can make it happen for FY23.
Okay, thank you. Great question from Daniel. What do you expect from IQ Pediatric Working Group?
So from us, one thing that Daniel and I have done with several of the groups that we've interfaced with, and I'll give the example of the European Formulation Group. If you as a working group, after seeing this conversation, have some ideas that you would like to put pen to paper, whether it be, for example, in the pre-competitive space, those key areas where you need an implementer, and that's how did Trupti word it? Hub. Like, think of us as a hub of resources that we could actually implement a need. Like if there's a bitter blocker project or an excipient project where there's a critical gap that you think our resource could potentially play a role, based on the expertise that you might be willing to provide as a member of the pediatric working group, that would be great. And if you could get that list to us, within the next couple of months, that we could start to look at that and identify potential projects to work with the working group on.
Okay, great. Yes, it's a great network to pull together those a list like that. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have for now. If anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to send them to myself. I can pass them along to Dr. Cummins or send them directly. And I think that the ask and hope is probably that the audience today will bring this back to their colleagues at their companies, bring this information back and share these valuable opportunities for projects and collaborations in the area of HIV. So, okay.
All right, thank you so much,
yeah.
Beth and Mahalea, and to the working group for participating today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you all very much for joining, and we'll talk to you soon.